Final Fantasy VII wasn't only Square Enix's first game with 3D characters in combat, it was one of those games that only come out every few years and change the perspective of the entire gaming industry. JRPGs might seem like a niche thing compared to CRPGs or Western RPGs in general nowadays, but this game really put the subgenre in the spotlight for 2 generations and helped keep it alive regardless of it going out of style every so often, at least in the Western market. It was originally planned as a Super Famicom game in 1994, with a very small team since the majority of the staff that graduated from Final Fantasy VI was working on another game called Chrono Trigger. Inevitably, the plans had to be halted in favor of everyone in the 17 helping get Chrono Trigger ready for 1995. At the same time, Squaresoft started experimenting with Silicon Graphics workstations to prepare for the upcoming 3D generation that would become mainstream with the arrival of the Sony PlayStation and Nintendo's next console. Yeah, they were aware of the Saturn II, but they never mentioned considering that platform. Square had a long history supporting Nintendo's platforms at this point. However, a number of factors led into them jumping ship to the Sony PlayStation. First, for whatever reason, despite how close to a second party their relationship with the company was, their feedback regarding the specifications of the Nintendo 64 hardware was being ignored again and again. For their ambitions with their next project, specifically their new plans for Final Fantasy VII, that hardware was not looking promising. Something they would eventually run a benchmark on and compare to the PlayStation, proving their fears to be very warranted. Second, once they were done with Chrono Trigger and the plans for Final Fantasy VII became closer to the game the world knows now, their ambitions involved lengthy event scenes and much bigger visual spectacle in and out of battle screens. All this had to be done with acceptable performance, which the Nintendo 64 hardware couldn't do, and more importantly, Nintendo's decision to stick to cartridges would make an impossible goal. Square had a terrible experience continuing to deal with the cartridge costs with some of their last passion projects for the Super Famicom. If you ever wondered why Bahamut Lagoon and Front Mission Gun Hazard never made it to the West, it's because the extra memory required made the cost of the cartridges soar, making the price to the consumers become very inaccessible. Sakaguchi blamed this directly for their low sales, and there was no way they would invest extra in localization, more marketing work. They thought making a huge game and splitting into 2 or 3 CDs was still tremendously cheaper by comparison, and they were correct. So the decision was made, officialized with a first ever TV ad that stated Final Fantasy VII was in development for the Sony PlayStation. The start of the development of 7 also brought changes to Squaresoft's entire pipeline. If you recall from my Final Fantasy VI review, I mentioned how literally every staff member would contribute to creative decisions instead of games being the vision of 1 or 2 guys. For FF7, they would start organizing the staff and the tasks more in line with how movies were made, with each department having very strict roles. In regards to the creative vision, Sakaguchi came up with the initial concept, then Yoshinori Kitase and Tetsuya Nomura built upon it, becoming the main driving force for where the details of the story would go. At some point before they were ready to start development proper, Tetsuya Takahashi and Kaori Tanaka, 2 members of the past projects that included Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger, wrote a pitch together for what they proposed could be the plot for Final Fantasy VII. It was rejected for being too complex and dark, but Sakaguchi encouraged Takahashi to just go ahead and make their own game using the concepts from that pitch. That game would turn into... we'll talk about that one some other time. Either way, I gotta say there definitely are some concepts from that pitch, and that game that shall not be named yet that Final Fantasy VII's final plot definitely seems to borrow from. I can't find evidence online to suggest someone intentionally applied those ideas without admitting what the source was, and neither Takahashi nor Kaori Tanaka seem to have accused anyone, so I'm not going to dwell on that any longer. While Final Fantasy VI was written not to have a single character designed to be the one protagonist, Final Fantasy VII was planned to have Cloud Strife as the protagonist from the beginning of its PlayStation development. Aerith and Barret were the first additional characters they came up with, and Nomura chose to take inspiration of the legend of Miyamoto Musashi and Sasaki Kojiro to come up with Sephiroth as the bad guy, which explains why Sephiroth uses a long katana as well as Cloud's Buster Sword, being inspired by the ore Miyamoto Musashi carved for his duel against Kojiro. Yes, that means Square found inspiration in Miyamoto Musashi even before Brave Fencer Musashi was being developed. VII's narrative was written to focus on filling all the details of the plot, then adding characters as necessary, rather than coming up with the main cast first. The setup for the plot involves Cloud being hired as a mercenary by an activist group called Avalanche, who is fighting against a mega corporation called Shinra. Shinra's entire business is focused on using a non-renewable energy source called Mako for all their products and services, which Avalanche members believe is sucking the life out of the planet. When you start the game, Avalanche and Cloud are on their way to bomb one of the Mako reactors that power Midgard. The bombing mission ends up being a success, albeit with unexpected casualties the corporation uses to continue to frame the group as terrorists meant to be feared by the population. With the second bombing mission's success being considered a given, the group is caught in a trap that begins a series of tragedies that sets in unexpected new directions in order to save the planet. Now, I know some of the big plot twists in this game get spoiled to death, but I don't care. I'm following my policy to expect someone watching this wants to experience the story for themselves. Midgard is a massive city complex entirely controlled by Shinra that thrives on the promises of comfortable day-to-day lives to its townspeople. But in reality, that comfortable life is a privilege only accessible to a few, those living atop its many sectors, while those living under make do in makeshift slums, a not at all subtle reference to the dark reality of a modern capitalist world. Not subtle, but still very on point, I have to say. Some things just haven't changed in decades for a real world, unfortunately. Right from the get-go, it's a very depressing state of affairs that this setting is in. While on the forefront of this dark narrative is where all the cool stuff lies. Cloud is an ex-soldier. Soldier in this setting meaning Mako-infused Shinra elite with incredible combat skills. So Cloud is often doing a lot of cool stuff like jumping on a moving train, escaping on bikes, and generally being a badass. Every other character in the main cast has something to justify their combat abilities. Barret is a big beefy guy with a big gun that replaces his lost arm. Tifa was trained by one of the greatest martial artists in the world. Red 13 comes from a warrior tribe. You get the picture. In spite of the very anime look they went with for Final Fantasy VII, the world is somehow way more grounded than the series had ever been. Like there was a lot of effort trying to make the characters, the locations, and technology and magic to fit together in a way that is easily explained in the context of the game. The series is no stranger to high fantasy settings that drop super advanced nearly sci-fi factions and technology sooner or later. But 7, much like 6, makes the extent of its own fictional technology clear to you from the beginning. If 6 was themed after Industrial Revolution, 7 is bordering what I can only describe as low cyberpunk mixed with scientifically explained magic, which I argue is another parallel to some of Tetsuya Takahashi's games. Before you say, "Hey, I played Cyberpunk 2077 and it looks nothing like this," let me remind you this is a game from 1997, so shh. While the main plot doesn't move as quickly as games like, say, Final Fantasy VI or Chrono Trigger, for the standards of the time, 7 often sacrificed the pacing in favor of long character building. You didn't have this level of writing with so much focus on building the main character's arc and all the drama surrounding it back then, so the game's story was seen as a huge deal by fans of this approach. While people who only care about the main story moving along thought and still think the character-focused dialogue was excessive and made them lose interest in what's happening. But really, this is just the obvious path from what 6 was trying to do with its character writing, and what I argued in the past, 5 was responsible for starting, and this became the bread and butter of the franchise's writing. 6 was no slouch in the character department, but the reduced playable cast allowed for 7 to double down on characters interacting, building their relationships, and exploring their motivations as a group traveling together. Although, as always, there are exceptions. You can tell which characters were late additions without much thought put into them by how half-assed their explanation for them taking along is. And if you played the original Final Fantasy VII, you don't need me to give you the two names. On the antagonist front, where 7 shines isn't so much on what the main threat is, but how many factions there are and how the progression of the plot affects them. Again, try to put yourself at the time this game was fresh, since we're probably spoiled about the twists online. But there's a pretty big number of antagonists you see playing on screen roles in the story all the way to Disc 3. And because it would be really weird not to bring this up in a video about Final Fantasy VII, there is a clear environmental message behind the plot. Mako energy is obviously an analogy to non-renewable energy and fossil fuel exploitation. The entire planet is dying plot is another in a series of anti-pollution, anti-waste statements that were common in the late 80s and through the 90s, but I didn't feel like it was ham-fisted, as they were able to envelop that theme neatly in an engaging story that works even if our planet Earth was a perfect paradise. Replaying this game and paying more attention to the story after playing 7 Rebirth only a year before was a really interesting experience for many reasons. But as far as narratives go, while Rebirth definitely crushes the original's character writing, I was tremendously surprised by how well the original holds up, in spite of how certain bigger Final Fantasy YouTubers enjoy trashing it as something that is too silly and didn't age well because the remake exists or something. I think there is still a lot here that is done better than some of the newer JRPGs, especially from Square Enix's original internal studios. Now I want to touch on a big spoiler territory involving Sephiroth and Genova that if you haven't played or seen the entire story, you should skip to this part of the timeline. So, Sephiroth. Sephiroth, the fallen legendary hero, isn't super interesting as a character. I know a few fans who will disagree, but I don't care. I think his characterization sucks, but you shouldn't look at him as an individual. He works because he fits the villain archetype of force of nature. He's always promoted as the main villain of the 7 franchise. He's the villain you will see the most of. He's the guy that summons the meteor that will destroy the planet, he's the one manipulating Cloud, and he's the final boss. However, he's not the actual main antagonist force in the game. That title belongs to Genova. But Genova doesn't talk or gets to do cool stuff on screen, and right behind Genova you have Hojo, who is a completely terrible person directly responsible for the experiments resulting from his research on Genova's cells. But really, just stop and think about it. Hojo and Sephiroth are collateral damage resulting from Genova's arrival. Genova is essentially Lavos from Chrono Trigger again. By the time the party leaves Midgar, Sephiroth has essentially become one with Genova in the livestream, but even though he's the one we see taking all the actions on screen, his ultimate goal aligns with what Genova as a planetary scale parasite would have been doing from the beginning. So in the end, it's still Genova's shadow that's the biggest threat looming over the Earth. In my opinion, when you look at those two with that angle, both Genova and Sephiroth become far more interesting entities. Villains functioning like evil forces of nature rather than individuals with some ambition that clashes with the protagonist can work incredibly well for epic narratives, and I think Final Fantasy VII did more than a decent job with that. The biggest negative in the narrative is that same problem that many RPGs always had and so far still have more often than not. Most of the playable characters kind of fade in the background once their personal arcs wrap up. Writing a story where everyone in a cast of 7 or 8 characters is constantly being developed until the end is hard, I know, but it's still very noticeable, especially when their arcs are resolved before the halfway point. And Final Fantasy games are unfortunately still notorious for ending the development of characters and just keeping them around as author ex machina or so someone can speak generic lines in a cutscene. Anyway, even with some of those revelations being nearly impossible to miss by just talking to gamers online or just glancing at anything from Square Enix these days, if who the villains are and that scene at the end of Disc 1 are the extent of the big spoilers you're aware of, there's still a lot that goes on in between that is worth experiencing for the first time. Final Fantasy VII is a Japanese-style console RPG with combat happening through random encounters. If you don't know what the basic template of a JRPG is by now, sorry, I'm tired of explaining it, I just can't anymore. 7 doesn't hide items out of the player's screen anywhere near as much as the past games in the series. The hidden items are mostly visible in form of small 3D objects that shine every few seconds or white bags. Sometimes they will be visible, but it's up to you to figure out how to reach them, which in my opinion is a better approach than expecting the player to go on a pixel hunt. This makes the exploration of each individual area more interesting than before. Often the item or material you get from figuring out the path or puzzle out is worth it, even if it's a piece of equipment that will be replaced a few hours later. Unfortunately, this game doubles down on missables. When it came out, everyone was riding the guide and FAQ bandwagon because the average player really did not want to miss out on any secrets. To this day, it's recommended to use a guide if you hate missing on items and material. Okay, I've cited this material thing twice, so what the heck is it? Materia is the single most important feature in Final Fantasy VII's combat. Materia is a system inspiring the Magicite or Aspers from Final Fantasy VI, and dare I say also borrows from Final Fantasy V's job system. Either way, it's a form of evolution of those two. Any character in Final Fantasy VII has attack, items, defend, and role change as the battle commands. But for every other kind of command, they need to equip materia on the slots of their weapons and armbands. Materia comes in a few types. Magic materia will let the character cast magic, command materia will let the character use that command, support materia will apply a passive ability based on the materia that's paired with it, summon materia will let you use a summon, and independent materia will apply an effect on the character by just being equipped in any slot. The types are all color-coded. Support materia requires the slots in your gear to have links, or they won't do anything. Most equipment comes with at least 2 paired slots, but sometimes you're going to decide on equipping something that doesn't because their attack or defense stats outweigh the usefulness of the support materia, or they give you twice as much ability points, which you earn from battles to level up materia. When materia levels up, the next item in its list is unlocked. It could be an upgrade to the command like, say, Steel Turning to Mug, or the next tier of the magic spell like unlocking Fire 2 when leveling up the Fire magic materia. Unlocking more commands, more magic spells, and making the support abilities more effective by leveling up materia is one of those types of progression mechanics that give a big dopamine rush. And because you can just transfer the level up materia between characters, you don't feel like you're hitting the reset button when changing your party. The materia system is one of the most awesome character customization systems in the series on paper. The way it's implemented comes with a lot of balance problems, which get very exacerbated by what they've done to the combat itself. When I played the pixel remasters of Final Fantasy IV, 5, and 6, and set their combat to active, I was able to experience what made the ATB system work well. This is why I always suggest anyone to avoid setting it to wait, assuming you want to experience ATB the way it's meant to be. The clock doesn't stop while you're thinking about what to do. For random encounters, that usually meant learning what combination of commands were the most effective to finish enemies off quickly and avoid triggering dangerous enemy counters. Like learning what song and dance each type of encounter required after your first build, so you don't need to give the enemy extra time to chip away your HP or ruin your setup with nasty debuffs. ATB also exists to let you keep 1 or 2 characters on standby to use the right command on the right time, or be ready to support the party after the enemy gets everyone in a bad condition. You don't always have to issue commands to everyone right away, and that's a key component that makes this a very different system to actual turn-based combat. Timing is important. Then I got to Final Fantasy VII, as suddenly my memories of the PlayStation Final Fantasy combat came back, and this realization came down like a bucket of ice on my head. This is it. This is where the ATB system started crawling towards its grave. The combat in Final Fantasy VII starts off decent enough. It looks very much like the Final Fantasy you knew and loved, but with way more cinematic presentation. Dynamic camera angles, incredible flashy long animations and special effects. This had to be a natural progression from what they were doing before. After all, these games feature many basic combat so you could watch the animations happening without compromising the gameplay. The grandiose presentation is just something that I think is part of the brand's identity, so I don't think the animations should be considered a problem on their own. But I do have to point out that starting with VII, they didn't think too much about balancing animation length with the effective impact they had. Obviously, there are some ridiculously long animations like a few of the final boss's attacks that justify how flashy they are with the high damage. But you run into enemies launching really weak or nearly useless moves that come with animations that force you to wait like between 5 and 10 seconds. Stronger or more dangerous attacks came with longer animations in the past games, and that worked perfectly because you would use their animations as a buffer, so you could immediately retaliate or prepare your party to stand at their feet. Final Fantasy VII fails twice over by comparison because in addition to the many long animations being unnecessary, too many of them would cause the ATB gauge to freeze on active mode. To clarify, the difference between active and wait has always been only whether or not the clock stops when you're navigating sub-menus of your commands. But that doesn't excuse the bad implementation here. Why the hell does this game pause the ATB so goddamn much? Remember the materia system? Materia is the big deciding factor in how each character plays. Sure, every character has a different weapon type, but aside from Aerith, who isn't fit to use physical attacks, every one you can replace in your party is completely interchangeable. None of them are required over another to play any specific role in your strategies because you can transfer every materia, and none of them have unique commands like Final Fantasy VI characters had. This is something that was planned from the start and even citing interviews to be intentional. You pick characters based on who is your favorite rather than what they can bring to your tactics. I guess a lot of people like this, but personally, I don't. To me, what each character can and can't do is part of their identity, or at least it should be, in any RPG with predefined playable characters. I like having to build my party based on where I'm going and what I'm fighting. I don't think a game needs necessarily to make the challenge impossible to clear without a specific party composition, but it should be offering me different experiences based on that. In Final Fantasy VII, that's completely absent, and I think that makes the combat gameplay worse. Characters in 6 could be considered interchangeable in all the moments magic was much more effective than unique abilities, but at least that game forced you to grind your magic side for hours on end to get to that point, while being completely beatable without it thanks to those unique character commands and special weapons. Characters in 7 are interchangeable even before you leave Midgar, which is only a few hours into the game, and while special weapons do exist, they are very few and the characters mostly progress with their weapons in a very linear fashion. Oh, that's right! We can't forget about the new and heavily promoted feature, the limit breaks! Every character has a set of limit breaks to use once the limit break gauge is full. Those are meant to replace unique commands from 6 and mechanically feel like an evolution of the desperate moves of that same game. Desperate moves had a random chance to be triggered when choosing the attack command for a character that was almost incapacitated. Limit breaks get rid of the random factor. You can use them whenever you feel like once the gauge is full, even save it for another battle if your character doesn't get killed. Each character starts with one limit break. They unlock another one by using that limit break a number of times. They also unlock a new tier of limit breaks by killing a number of enemies. Most characters have 2 limit breaks per tier, while I feel like Catchy only get 1 per tier. The 4th and final tier requires an item to be unlocked, sometimes tied to a side quest in the end of Disc 2 or Disc 3. Limit breaks are pretty cool to unlock and watch the animations for. They feature some of the coolest animations in the game. They're also incredibly powerful for how easy it is to abuse them. The first tier isn't that broken, but even without unlocking level 4 limit breaks, you can outclass almost every other command with limit breaks to the point some of them will destroy bosses with their multiple 4-digit number damage hits. The gauge fills based on how much damage a character takes in relation to their maximum HP. The sadness status some enemies can inflict makes it increase lower, while a Fury makes it increase faster. An easy strategy is to apply Fury using an item so your gauge charges fast. Even without this strategy, you can easily max your gauge before or during a boss fight if you're not overleveled. And as long as your character don't die, that limit break will always get activated sooner or later if you're struggling to finish the boss off fast enough. So it's like this big overpowered get out of jail card. At the time, like many players, I thought the limit break mechanic was really cool and satisfying to use. But nowadays, I think it makes an easy game a lot easier and doesn't add any depth. It doesn't even add enough uniqueness to the characters. Almost every limit break has the same effect of doing big damage, so who cares if it's Barret or Tifa doing it? The only thing that changes is the animation or how many extra hits they cause. And that's not even the only layer of broken mechanic, because this game floods you with resources through command materials. In addition to magic, you can also use enemy skill, which works exactly like blue magic in Final Fantasy V, but is so much more powerful when you learn enough skills that the character with enemy skills equipped doesn't need to use magic material at all. If that's still not enough power to you, how about the double attack material? By the time you're able to get it, Cloud will already be dealing over 2000 damage with the attack command, or Slash All, which lets anyone attack the whole row of enemies with the attack command. Or how about using the 3 variations of Bahamut that exist in this game and deal high non-elemental damage? Or even the infamous Knights of the Round, which hit for over 7000 like 13 times per cast. Though I'll concede that the last variation of Bahamut is locked behind grinding summon materia, and Knights of the Round is locked behind one of the longest side quests in the game. But my point here is, this game has a lot of really powerful commands and mechanics that make the game extremely poorly balanced in the player's favor. It's multiple layers of overpowered tools, one on top of another, in a game where most encounters are undertuned even without any of those tools. Level 3 limit breaks are very trivial to unlock by just playing the game. You're always being showered in all types of materia, and it only takes one character with overpowered loadouts to break any battle but the super bosses on Disc 3. I'll at least say this. There is enough customization here that you can replay the game with different combinations. That's definitely a positive. Overall, if it's not obvious, I thought the battle gameplay in Final Fantasy VII to be the least fun I've had with a Final Fantasy game so far. It's designed to be very easy and accessible, which allowed for this game to be an entry point into the genre for millions of people back then. There was a lot more focus on the presentation than on the attempt to challenge players, and judging by the developer interviews, that may have been by design, so despite my grievances, I can't call it a failure. It's succeeding in what they were trying to accomplish with it. The gaming community likes to call 7 one of the easiest number Final Fantasy games, and I have to agree with them. Whether that's a bad thing or not is up to you. Final Fantasy VII is well known for its introduction of mandatory minigames in the story and the optional minigames too. There are lots and lots of minigames, and most of them are extremely simple, only there to add a bit more variety to the main play cycle. Some of them I can take or leave, but I think the variety is very welcome. They do go overboard like how the remake games do it, with a few exceptions like the one chocobo race your first win. The more involved optional minigames can vary a lot in the game genre they're based on, so your mileage will always vary. You could love them or you could hate them, either way they're usually pretty easy to clear if you learn the basics. The minigames are just some of the sheer amount of optional content scattered through the game. There seems to be a side quest triggered somewhere every couple hours, which is great if you like exploring. I think the way side quests are spread also makes the world of the game seem more alive. There are also puzzles to figure out, often for optional goodies. Some can be pretty tricky, but the solutions are well documented at this point if you're only in this game for the story. Anyways, this game isn't long by modern standards, but if you enjoy taking your time with side content, you will be impressed by how much there is to do. My final thoughts on the gameplay are mixed. This might sound odd, but the main feature I always need to feel good in any RPG is the combat, not the story and not the actual roleplay. I think Final Fantasy VII improves on all other aspects of the main gameplay loop of the series, just not in the combat. I don't hate its combat, but I find it very shallow and its use of ATB to be probably the worst implementation in the franchise. If the main scenario in Final Fantasy XIV taught me anything, is that for a lot of players, that illusion of attrition during combat that isn't actually there is enough to give a sense of accomplishment. Maybe what 7 is doing with its battle system will be enough for you, and that's okay. To begin stating the obvious, Final Fantasy VII was the first entry to use 3D models for characters and battle scenes. It was also the first to feature full motion video. You'd think after Sega CD, people would be over FMVs in games, but the thing is the video quality on the PlayStation was ahead of the Sega CD, PC Engine CD, or Sega Saturn by a mile, and developers were starting to make them a lot more impressive and cinematic. Final Fantasy VII's FMVs were very ahead of the competition, even though, looking at them now, they look pretty dated and silly. The most impressive thing about the implementation of the FMVs is that Square's team found a way to make the gameplay seamlessly transition to FMVs and vice versa. Through the lifetime of the original PlayStation, this was extremely rare in games. Every time there was something happening in the story they knew wouldn't look very interesting with the standard in-game presentation, there would be an FMV started. There were so many, Squaresoft's brand would become associated with the quality and quantity of CGI cutscenes, as many of us called back then. Truth be told, the file size of the FMVs is a big reason why their games had to be split into multiple discs. But enough about FMVs. You'll notice the game is only 100% in 3D during battles or when exploring the overworld. The exploration of towns, dungeons, and other locations is done by moving around with 3D models over a single background image. These days, the pre-rendered scenery might be hard to look at when playing any official HD version of the game, because without mods they're displaying in very low resolution. But back then, I thought these looked better than full 3D environments for the amount of detail the areas had. They had previously tried this approach with games like Chrono Trigger, and future games, even when not in 3D like Legend of Mana, would continue to use it. I think the implementation in 2D games definitely aged better. For Final Fantasy VII, the downside is that it can be hard to tell where you can or can't go. Sometimes you see what looks like a door, but find out it's just decoration. Thankfully, you can press the select button to display icons that help you identify the ladders, stairs, and exits. Naturally, the PlayStation was more than powerful enough to render multiple layers of 2D images, so some areas feature more than one of those to add a sense of depth to views in the distance or for foreground detail. Final Fantasy VIII and IX definitely made more and better use of that though. I've already talked about how cinematic and flashy the battle scenes are, but you should also notice character models are simplified to some small, super deformed versions outside of battles and some of them the FMVs. While researching for this video, I got the impression they weren't aiming to use those super deformed models at all, and so maybe it was just something they had to go with to make them stand out more from the backgrounds and to avoid performance issues. Because while the battle models looked cool, the whole thing ran at about 15 frames per second. Either way, I don't remember fans feeling bothered by the chibi models in the field. With how Final Fantasy character sprites used to look, I guess we just took for granted that they would go with 3D equivalent. It's only nowadays that people trash this style. Me personally, I recognize they didn't age well, but I'll just say I'll take the Sony PlayStation look over the HD versions any day. Something about using HD textures in models with very few polygons just looks completely off-putting to me. And don't get me started with the stupid mouths they add in the remaster. The battle graphics also didn't age the best, mostly because the use of textures and the strange color choices making every enemy in someone look like their toys or made of Play-Doh. But again, for the time, these were some sweet detailed looking models that showed off what could be done with a PlayStation. Many games in general tend to go with the super deformed models since they take place in field scenes. The UI itself follows the style of the 16-bit games. The melodies of the Final Fantasy VII soundtrack have become classics among gamers and gaming content creators. But a trend I noticed is that an increasing number of people have become more critical of the sound font used in the original PlayStation release. I'm not gonna tell those people are wrong, because I'm inclined to agree with them. Going from 6 to 7, you'd expect the technology to allow for better sounding music, but they decided to use the PlayStation's internal sound chip instead of going with CD audio. The result speaks for itself. but there are still tracks that sound great to listen to. The battle themes are extremely memorable, the main theme motif is a great composition, and the new arrangement of Sally's theme still sounds great. Every completely original theme, sorry. And speaking of recycled chunks of completely unrelated music, has anyone else noticed how similar Sephiroth's theme sounds to the sealed book theme from Final Fantasy V? Anyway, in Nobuo Uematsu's defense, they didn't want to deal with the playback delay that usually happens when using CD audio, and VII's music doesn't suffer from any of those low-time delays for its background audio as a result. This choice also gave VII music a very unique sound that isn't replicated in any other Final Fantasy for what it's worth. But something I find absolutely endemic of how VII defined the future direction of the series is a very ordinary piece in soundtrack. One single track, the Victory Fanfare. This track alone speaks for where the series was heading then. Until VII came out, this is what that fanfare sounded like. Then VII came out and this might seem like a tiny change that shouldn't mean anything, but it does. To me it's like a statement. The intro is familiar, then it transitions into a completely new tune. This is still Final Fantasy, but we're done simply iterating on the traditions. That's what it says. As for sound effects, well, I know I've been saying this a lot, but they haven't aged very well either. Some of it sounds fine, but then there's a lot of it that sounds like it belongs in a NES game. Very out of place in a 3D game. I laughed the first time I saw Bahamut looking badass and letting out that goofy NES sounding roar. That type of disconnect happens often. I honestly think 6 beats 7 both in music and sound direction because they just fit better. But 7 is not horrible, I suppose. This is one of the few games I consider mandatory experiences for anyone who considers themselves JRPG fans or care about the history of video games. The only reason we're getting a 3-part remake is because of how huge the original game was. 7 became a big influence inside and outside of Squaresoft. It paved the way for Yoshinori Kitase to take the helm of the series and made Tetsuya Nomura one of the most important figures in the company. It changed what the typical development pipeline in the games would follow for the foreseeable future, making Squaresoft and soon Square Enix become this giant brand for Japanese RPG lovers. It would influence how other Japanese studios would design some of their characters for a while, and while I'm sure the protagonist of the manga series Berserk might have something to do with it, it also popularized the use of ridiculously large swords and outrageous fashion. Anyway, 7 is definitely the game that shaped Square as the company they are today. This is as good as an entry point to the genre as any, so it's an easy recommendation if you're able to get over the blocky, strangely colored models and random battles. If you can play the PlayStation version, that's the version I would recommend, even if it lacks the quality of life features of the remaster. I just think it looks way better. But the gameplay and narrative experience will be mostly the same, so get the remaster on Steam or any of the other modern consoles if that's more readily available. Before I end the video, I just want to say thank you for helping the channel reach 300 subscribers. Final Fantasy VIII will also be getting its own long video, but I'd like to put a bunch of shorter videos again to take a breather for a while. If we happen to hit another milestone before then, I'll drop everything to prioritize covering Final Fantasy VIII right away. As always, thank you so much for watching and take care.